So, let's talk about the Sabbath. It's a topic I've addressed before, but we're going to jump on it again here. Here's a thought: the Sabbath is your opportunity to demonstrate to God how you would use freedom from toil. So, toil is a curse, in quotes, from God given at the fall of man. So God told Adam, by the sweat of your brow, you will till the land and get your daily bread. And that is something that a lot of interesting things could be said about. But for the sake of this little moment, I just want to focus on this idea. There will come a time where a set of people once again live in similar circumstances to the Garden of Eden, only with clothes. So there will be some other differences too, but that it's in character it's quite similar to the Garden of Eden, with some notable differences. But one thing that will be similar is the lack of need to work. So it's an interesting, fruitful vein of thought to investigate what exactly God has the power to do, and under what circumstances does he do it, and under what circumstances does he not do it. And we know that God has the power to feed us without us needing to work, even right here, right now. He did it with the children of Israel with manna from heaven. Now that is a really important story. It's quite valid to the point. So, for various reasons, or in various ways, the children of Israel really missed the boat in their journey towards the promised land. I'm going to try to stay brief about this and focused on the point, but it's a topic I would love to say more about. To the point, they did not have to work. For 40 years, they did not have to work. So imagine if someone gave you the opportunity to live for 40 years without needing to work. Wouldn't that be wonderful? So they never had to make new clothes. They never had to farm anything. All they had to do was gather the food that they ate. That's all they had to do to sustain their life. Their water was provided for them. Their food was provided for them. Their clothing was provided for them. Nothing wore out. Everything was good. So the question is, what would you do if you were put into that circumstance? And you don't have to wonder what your answer to this question is, because the answer is, what did you do last Sunday? What did you do the Sunday before that? What did you do the Sunday before that? Now, to avoid the landmine here, I realize that there are people who work on Sundays, and we don't need to get into debating whether that's necessary or whatever in particular circumstances. We're talking about a general principle here. We can have a conversation about particulars some other time and place. But by and large, as far as the principle goes, the idea of a Sabbath day, it is not a prescription of loss or withholding. It is an opportunity to practice a mindset and to measure a mindset that applies to a future time and place. It's also a free sample that we get to enjoy once a week for a circumstance that we do not yet qualify for, or at least almost no one does. So that's the question, is what would you do if you didn't have to work? So there's no shortage of people that would love to retire. But if you ask them why, they'd say, well, because I don't want to have to work. And maybe you can find people with other reasons, but honestly speaking, that's going to be the majority motive. Here's a better way. What if your answer was, because I have found something better to do? So if you have something better to do, that's probably what you do on Sundays, unless it's something you can't squeeze into a day or something that doesn't fit. You have to live in a certain place to work where you do, or whatever. But generally speaking, if you have something better to do, you're probably doing it more fully on Sundays. There are two things that are associated with this I want to touch on. One is, this is not very different from the question of why would you want to live forever? So there are many people who, if there was some pill you could take to live forever, they would take it. If you ask them why, they'd say, well, I don't want to have to die. A better way is because you have found something worth living for. So if God came to you and he said, what do you want? I'll give you anything. What do you want? In fact, this is unrelated, or only slightly related, but here's a fun exercise. And I cannot remember for the life of me if I've talked about this on a video, or if it's in a blog post, or if this is just something I've spoken to specific people about. But if God came to you and he gave you a sheet of paper, 8.5 by 11, and he said, anything you write on this paper, I will give you. What would you write on that paper? So there may be some of you who could put at least something on that paper right away, confidently, in ink, not worrying about being able to erase it. But many of you would probably have to sit and think about that for quite some time. And that's rather unfortunate, because as fanciful as this circumstance may seem, I assure you that your life is not all that different from what I just said. Now, instead of a paper, he's given you a tablet. And it's not a tablet of stone, it's a tablet of flesh. Your life is the paper. The question is, what book are you writing on that paper? What are you seeking? What are you willing to pay for what you seek? How much effort have you exercised in finding a way to obtain it? I wrote a book called Through Faith, and you can search for that on Amazon. As far as I know, it's the only book called Through Faith. That's by Robert Smith. You can also find it on the blog, upwardthought.blogspot.com. And I have to say that because every once in a while there's some comment on YouTube like, I don't know where to find this stuff. So that's where you find it. But it's all about how you go about thinking about what you want and going out and getting it with the knowledge of who and how God is, which changes everything, both in terms of what you're willing to go look for, what you choose to go look for, how you do it, and how successful you will be in doing so. Anyway, getting back to, we'll go back through the paper, back to this note. So wanting to live forever is a funny thing, because most people would say, yeah, I want that. But then you'd ask them why, and it's like, well, so I can maximize short-term pleasure and avoid short-term pain. And that's not a very good reason. And sure enough, no one has ever achieved that outcome with that reason. Okay, so now to want to retire. It's a good thing to desire freedom from toil, but it wouldn't look like you think it would. I put curse in air quotes when I mentioned that the need to work, the need to toil is a curse that God bestowed upon Adam. It's a blessing he bestowed upon Adam. And that will make your head spin a little bit. It turns out that there's a whole basket of things that I really don't want to get into at the moment that are really hard to deal with, unimaginably difficult to deal with once you start going down the road towards God. These are things that you wouldn't imagine exist, and you certainly wouldn't be able to imagine the scope of how terrible they are without someone telling you or experiencing them yourself. Someone vividly explaining to you what it's like. So it turns out that the toil is actually a blessing because it gives you a daily break from the intensity of what I'll just call the gospel process. So we ought to be praying to God at all times and all places and having our hearts drawn out toward him. But when you're doing something, you cannot help but focus on that thing that you're doing. And even as you're praying all day long, your prayers tie into that topic. And usually, if you're using your brain or your body trying to do something that's difficult, it eats up the additional resources you might have to do background processing on whatever gospel thing is going on in your understanding at the moment. And so it's an enormous blessing to have daily toil. And people look at it as this terrible thing. The funny thing about it is, not only is it a spiritual break in a way, it's not that you're ceasing to use your spiritual capacity, it's just that it's diverted onto something that's much easier to deal with, much more predictable, much less rich, much less intense than raw spiritual progress with God. So not only is that the case, but fundamentally, the toil is the vehicle for exactly what God needs to teach you right now. It's a marvelously rich channel where he can teach you precisely what you need to know right now, in the precise increment that you need to know it right now, for the maximal long-term benefit to you and everyone that you can have an impact on. And so don't be so focused on this idealized version of what it would be like to live without toil that you miss the blessing right before you right now in having the blessing of working the land, so to speak, each day for your daily bread. There's a line in this ridiculous movie called Kicking and Screaming that my kids quote all the time, where this hapless kid soccer coach, he's just trying to learn how to do his job, and he buys all the kids finches for celebrating. It was a game I think they lost, but whatever. Anyway, so he gives them all, and the kids are like, "What are these?" And he said, "They're finches." And the one kid says, "Do we have to take these home?" And the coach says, "You get to take them home. Yes, you get to have one." And so the kids we always do this back and forth. When someone says, "Do I have to whatever?" some kid will say, "You get to do that." So we don't have to toil, we get to toil. And that's a very valuable perspective. And so zooming out a bit, because this is a pattern that happens all over the place, where we're looking afar off at these blessings that we think are going to be a certain way, and newsflash, they are not that way. And if you knew what they were really like, you wouldn't want them because of where you are right now. You need to develop further to want them in the first place, because they're not what you think they are. And if someone were to hand them to you right now, today, immediately, you would, at best, you would ignore them. At worst, you would try to kill them. But somewhere in between, you would probably get angry and or throw it on the ground and stamp it out. That's something that you need to realize, that we don't actually value things that are valuable. And what we think is valuable is at best worth very little. Usually it's extremely harmful. But what is valuable in God's perspective, we do not find that valuable. Not yet. That's part of the process. When you start finding it valuable, he starts to give it to you. So, anyway. So, there's one more point I wanted to make about that. Yeah, so the pattern is don't be so anxious about what lies afar off that you miss what's right before you, which incidentally is the exact thing you need to become prepared for that thing that is still afar off. Okay, so now I want to share with you a story that's not funny, but I find it hilarious. And this is from Ezekiel 4. And Ezekiel is he's a very impressive person. So this, I just find it hilarious, but it's kind of out of character for him. But I also find the Lord's response hilarious. And again, none of this is funny to any normal person. So I fully acknowledge that. So in Ezekiel 4, there's this exchange between Ezekiel and the Lord where the Lord's instructing him to provide this sign to the people. And it consists of him making these barley cakes and then making a fire out of human poop and cooking the barley cakes on the human poop. And this story is fun for a lot of reasons. One, it's always fun when God uses these visceral things that people just don't want to deal with to help them understand the severity of the consequences that they are heaping onto themselves or missing out on or whatever. In this case, it's the heaping onto themselves. And so the Lord instructs Ezekiel to do this elaborate sign where he's cooking this bread and he's going to eat it in front of them and basically say, well, I'll just quote it, verse 13, "Even thus shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, whither I will drive them." It's a really serious message. It's high stakes. It's a big deal. But this is one of the parts I find funny, is that Ezekiel's reply to this is, Lord God, behold, my soul hath not been polluted, for from my youth even till now have I not eaten of that which dieth of itself, or is torn in pieces, neither came there abominable flesh into my mouth. And so what he's basically saying is, from when I was a baby, I have perfectly lived the laws that you've given concerning what someone is to eat. And he said this because cooking bread on human poop, that would be unclean to eat that bread under the law. And God's response to this is, all right, well, you can use cow poop instead of human poop. And if you know anything about the Lord, you can imagine the gentleness with which he would say this and his understanding of Ezekiel's perspective. But to me, it's hilarious because to go to the Lord and tell him what's holy and what's not holy, it's just hilarious to me. I don't know how else to put it. Now, maybe it shouldn't be so funny because it is a problem that pretty much every religious person has. But to me, it's just funny because it just seems like common sense that if God tells you to do something, that's what you do. And your backing of, let me read to you, God, what your commandments are, that's kind of a funny argument to have. And that's certainly not one I would want to have. It's funny. There's a lot of funny today. It's funny how people don't seem to understand the gravity of taking a case to the Lord or someone who knows him well. So we don't have to get all weird and spiritual about this. If I have a meeting with a person who has achieved much in life, I'm not going to walk into that meeting lightly. Years and years ago, I heard a story, somebody was talking about this very thing. And they said they always go in with something to take notes with. They prepare for the meeting by thinking of some questions to ask. And they're always ready. They're more interested in hearing what that person has to say than what they have to say, but they're always ready to sort of poke into the conversation, try to stimulate some gem, some nugget of wisdom as applied to their own lives. And so this is a wonderful attitude to have with God, right? So if you had a meeting with the CEO of some huge company, for instance, and you were getting started in business of your own, you're not going to go in there with the idea that you're going to tell that person how to run a business, right? You're going to go into that meeting with the idea of you're going to learn something about how to run a business, because clearly this person has gotten further down that road than you, right? And by the way, they're not going to be interested in wasting their time with someone who thinks that they have something to teach them about it, right? Unless there's evidence, right? So if you're the CEO of an even larger company and you're having a meeting with someone, then they're going to assume that maybe you have something to teach them. And the closer the two companies are, relatively speaking, on whatever metrics you care about, the more those people will see each other as peers. But none of us are peers to God, right? That's just the way it is, and we never will be. Now, how close you can be in terms of intimacy between a father and a son, that is a wonderful and beautiful topic that I will not broach right now. But I have spoken about it before. I'll speak about it again. So this is important. And I bring in the whole CEO thing. That's not the end-all be-all. I went to go see a guy one time who has a lot of experience building and using greenhouses in western Montana. And I went with a notepad. I did research before I went. And when I got there, I said, teach me everything you wish you knew when you're starting out. And I wrote notes, right? And it was great. That particular guy also happens to have decades of experience doing mechanic work on cars. So I would fully expect that in those topics, I'm there to learn. If he wants to know something about plucking rocks out of terrible soil, I'm your guy. So, anyway, so that's what it comes down to. And this doesn't just apply to CEOs, mechanics, and greenhouse guys in God. It applies across the board in any topic. So, here's the point. God's commandments do not teach us what it means to be holy. God is what is holy. His commandments are to teach us about Him. Did you catch those relationships? The rule never supersedes what it points us to, who it points us to. And so when He comes to correct our understanding, that's not the time to start citing His rules to Him, His rules that He's given us for the purpose of teaching us more about Him. We ought to reverse that and say, okay, what new rules or different rules can I extract from what He's giving me now in terms of knowledge about Himself? That's how you fit the model. It's not the other way around. So, Ezekiel's funny in this Ezekiel chapter 4 exchange, because it surprises me that he would say that, but I guess we all have things that we've got to work on. So, and obviously the Lord didn't castigate him for it in any way. He understood where he was coming from, and his motive, I guess in Ezekiel's case, was pure. So he just rolled with the cow dung. But we have a lot of these exchanges. And this is related to the whole idea of Sabbath, because when you use the Sabbath to demonstrate what you would do with your life if you were free from toil, you're going to run smack into a bunch of sacred cows. And I don't want to get into particulars of this, because in doing so, I might put ideas in your head that will make it easier for you to do evil with wherever you are right now. That's obviously not my intent. So instead of that, I'll give you a little protection, a little protective curb. One wonderful thing about God is that as we get to know him, we start to catch on to the fact that coming up to him, there are many, many protections that are beautiful and wise and powerful. And as these things emerge and are taught, they come out with the protection like a safety thing on a pill bottle or something, where you got to try really hard to do it wrong. And that's the fullness of the gospel is beautiful for many reasons, and this is one of them. He really figured all this out. It's really obvious that he knows exactly what he's doing. It's amazing. It's amazing. And you only see this in retroactively looking in the rear view. You're like, oh my gosh, that he really knows what he's doing. And then you can apply that to the future in faith. But here's a nice protection on living a more full law of the Sabbath. The tendency of people is going to be, anytime there's liberty, they will use it as license to sin. I think a lot, the Lord teaches me a lot in terms of themes. You see these themes as headers in my book, even chapter headings, but usually subsection headings. And that's where it all spins around, and it's like a stick that you put into a cotton candy machine. The stick is the theme, and then he just spins all these ideas onto it. And so I was going to go further into that analogy. I'm trying to cut myself short. So the license that people use freedom for, that's connected to a theme that I call why we can't have nice things. Some of these themes are funny. Some of them are really, really serious. This is a funny one, and it's why we can't have nice things. You would be shocked. I could write a whole book called Why We Can't Have Nice Things. It'd be all about human nature. Let me just hit you with a couple of random ones to show you what I'm talking about. So one of these is the greater the truth, the less likely you are to accept it. Now that's crazy, because you'd think it'd be the opposite. We have this tendency to think that the better something is, the more obvious it will be that it's better. It's actually the opposite. It's actually the opposite. Now this doesn't mean that things that seem worthless are necessarily wonderful. But what is actually wonderful, you can guarantee it will seem worthless to you unless you are wonderful. So that's one. But there's a whole list of why we can't have nice things. And in this case with the Sabbath, the reason we can't have nice things is because you'll use it as a license to sin, which again ties into a whole bunch of other examples. So here's a protection from that. Because specifically what's going to happen is you'll be chilling on a Sunday and you'll think, oh, well, Rob said this, so let me just go, what are these gimmicks? Live my best life, whatever, and I'm going to go, I almost gave some specifics, and I don't want to. I don't want to dictate to you how that's going to go. You need to figure that out. But go do something that wouldn't be a good use of a Sunday. But you'll think it's a good use. But really, it'll just be going out to do something using your time as a license to do something that's not the best use of it. And so here's the protection. Don't be so hasty to obtain custom commandments, if you will, before you fully obey the prescribed ones. Now, this isn't some off-the-cuff idea. This is very much integral to the way the gospel works. The carnal commandments are not designed to fully instruct you on how God is. They can't do that. And there are many, many passages from Scripture that you might not be calling up to your mind with me saying this, but if I were to point them out to you and read them to you and say, see, you say, oh my gosh, I never saw that before. You're right. There are tons of them. The carnal commandments cannot teach you how God is. in any significant way. But what they can do is prove your willingness to subject yourself to God at an introductory level, which that part is going to offend a bunch of people because they're going to say, well, it's so hard to repent. Whether it's hard or not, it needs to be done, and it's the beginning. So I thought learning how to tell time was super hard, but it doesn't matter. You need to learn how to tell time, right? And then other things come later. So it didn't matter that when I was in, I don't know what grade you learned that in, second grade or something. I'd come home crying to my mom, and I couldn't figure out the clock and whatever. And it was just so hard to wrap my head around. She didn't say like, oh, there, it's okay. You don't have to, here's a Timex, you never have to learn how to tell time. And people think God is this giver of digital watches, and he's not. That's not the point, right? And were he to give you that watch, later on you'd be like, man, I really wish you hadn't done that. When you see more of the pie, you're going to say, man, I wish you had loved me enough. You're never going to say man to God, but you'd be like, you know what? I really wish that you would have just left me to grunt through it and figure it out, or maybe help me learn, but not done it for me, not given me some escape from this. Even if what you had to do to help me learn it was leave me in the consequences of not knowing how to tell time. And I'm like this super embarrassed 26-year-old who can't read the face of a watch, a non-digital watch. And maybe if people make fun of me enough, I'll have motivation to figure it out. That's not how we picture God's love. Anyway, this has been way, way more diverse in topic than I anticipated, but it's, I'm sure, useful for somebody. So we'll leave it as is. I think the last thing that I want to mention is, in terms of the Sabbath day topic, is how important it is, like we talked about, yield to whatever it is that God says with the poop cake. The other thing is, when God speaks, don't just yield in terms of obeying what he says. Also yield in terms of whatever it is you're doing. So I've used this phrase before of filaments of light. And there are a lot of ways to think about this, but I like thinking about galaxies and how they're this spiral and they're spinning. But if you look into pictures that have been taken of nebulas or whatever astrophysics structures, what you see is that energy in space is not evenly distributed. In fact, it's very much the opposite of that. It's clustered in huge intensities, but there are these fingers of light, literally, in the universe, or clouds of light with varying densities in there, and they make these really pretty pictures. But that is how the Spirit works with you as well. If you read in the beginning of the book of John, where Jesus is teaching about the Spirit being like the wind, there's more to that chapter, but let's not get into that. The point is that, like the wind, it shifts directions, there's intensity, you don't hear it unless you're paying attention. It's easier to see its effects than to notice them in any other way, unless you get blasted by it, which isn't fun. Unless you're on a, what do you call those things? The surfboards with the sails? Wind sail, maybe? So if you have an apparatus, or a ship with sails, if you have an apparatus to harness that, you want those gusts, but even then, if the gust is too strong, it will break the mainmast. So you can just take this wherever you'd like. But focusing this nest of ideas, whatever the Spirit calls your attention to is absolutely positively the most important thing you could be doing right now. Why? Because God said so. And so the world talks about this idea of flow. if you understand the way the Spirit of God works and exactly what human understanding is and how those things are intertwined, that idea of flow makes a lot more sense. And one of the keys of becoming highly productive is noticing when the Spirit is working on you and following that flow until the end. And so how is this connected to Sundays? By the way, next level is learning how to what's a good word for this? Learning how to be more proactive. I'll cushion it. Learning how to be more proactive in encouraging that to happen. So what does this have to do with Sundays? Well, they're very much related, because if you're freed from toil, you'd have a lot of time on your hands. You don't want too much time on your hands. You want to use the time that you have, all the resources you have, for the greatest good. And God knows that better than you. And so you need to become very pliable and very aware of God's impulses and very good at supplying the echoes to that. And so I had an experience this morning that ties these ideas together well, I think. So my morning time is very protected. I'm very protective of that time. The reason is the Lord has demonstrated quite clearly to me on multiple occasions that my willingness to cordon off my early morning time for Him, it enables Him to teach me things and give me experiences that couldn't otherwise occur. And so I'm protective of that time, and it pays dividends. Surprise, when you do what God says, wonderful things happen. So this morning I was doing my normal routine, and all of a sudden I wrote out a sentence or two of a thought that came to mind. And then there was a flash of a chain of all these things, including talking to a current potential investor for my company about this idea, because it had a direct overlap or application in the business world, although it was a general principle. And then, it was 1 a.m. or something, so I wasn't about to call him. I don't think he would have appreciated that. So I thought, well, the iron's hot on this. I better keep going and see what is the limit of what God wants to tell me about this. And so I opened up a program and started making some slides expanding this idea. And then I looked up, and an hour and a half or something had passed, maybe more. But I didn't notice the passage of time. That's always a really good indication of this flow. And I have produced a slideshow that was full of ideas that I've never encountered in business books or anything, but reflects the best I know about the ecosystem where that original idea lies. So I don't know if that's all too generic or not, but the point is I put the normal morning stuff on pause, and I did this thing that typically would be considered business activity. And when you live by the Spirit, you have to be pliable. You have to be flexible to what God wants you to do. And you can't say, oh, Lord, I've never eaten anything defiled. You have to just say, okay, let me be sure that this is from you and that you're telling me this, but all right, cool, let's do it. And you'll produce wonderful things in far less time than it would otherwise take, and to far greater impact, because He knows what He's doing. And it'd be a shame if you allowed things given to you to help you to turn into chains that constrain you from doing more for God, or becoming more because of what you receive from him, or doing more for others through what he enables you to do. So anyway, that's a brief brief. We could talk for 20 days about this. 40 days and 40 nights. So it's brief relative to the content. So some people will get some value out of what I've said here, and for other people it'll just seem like nonsense. That's fine, or just confusing stuff. But there we go. So I'll stop talking now. I hope this is useful. See ya.